Over the past months, Iran has once again become the center of global attention. Images of protests, women cutting their hair in public, students confronting security forces, and chants echoing through city streets have spread far beyond Iran's borders. These protests are not just about one incident, they touch on decades of repression, unfulfilled promises, generational anger, and a fundamental question: what kind of country should Iran be? Today, I want to understand what is really happening inside Iran, how historic these protests are, how the regime functions, and whether this moment could mark a turning point. To help us make sense of it all, I'm joined by someone who has been reporting closely on Iran and its politics, Tim Ross.
Hi,
Good
Constantin. Great to see you.
Tim Ross is a senior reporter at Politico, where he covers geopolitics, authoritarian regimes, and international power struggles. He has reported extensively on Iran, including its leadership, protest movements, and the Iranian diaspora. And he recently spoke directly with Reza Pahlavi, the son of Iran's last Shah. Tim, to start, why does this moment really matter from your perspective as a reporter who has covered Iran for years? How significant is what we are seeing right now?
Well, it seems, according to all the evidence that we can get from inside Iran, that these are essentially the most significant protests, some people say, since the 1979 revolution against that religious regime. And that really poses a great challenge to the Ayatollahs who have been running the country in an authoritarian and brutal dictatorship for the last 47 years. And the implications really for geopolitics, for economics of what might happen next in Iran could not be bigger. When you look at the influence that Iran has had on the war in Ukraine, it's been supplying Russia with weapons and Putin with an ally internationally. And it's been destabilizing, obviously, in terms of its influence, particularly in the Middle East. Everyone knows about the situation in Gaza and obviously well beyond that in Yemen and elsewhere. And clearly, Iran is a major exporter of oil and has the potential to upend the global economy in terms of the impact on the oil markets too. So the implications are huge for the world. But for a country of 90 million people that has really struggled under this dictatorship for almost half a century now, these protests are unprecedented in terms of their scale and in terms of their reach. And they have been growing until the last couple of days when we've seen a very brutal crackdown from the regime. And it's not clear yet what will happen next or whether this is the end or just a pause.
Exactly. There is a pattern that seems to repeat itself. There are protests and the regime cracking them down. So do you think this pattern is about to start over again at this point, what we're seeing and from what we can judge right now?
The big challenge we've all got, Constantin, and I'm sure you've seen this too, is that getting information that's reliable out of Iran right now is incredibly hard. Almost the first thing that the regime did was shut down the internet, cut off communications from within the country. And that was designed to do a couple of things. Most importantly, I think from the regime's perspective, they wanted to stop the protesters coordinating among themselves. That didn't work to start with, partly because we had Elon Musk's Starlink in the country, and that enabled, it wasn't allowed, it was banned, but people had smuggled in hundreds of these Starlink terminals, and that gave them a bit of a lifeline. Now, even they have been shut off, I understand, from some of the reports that we've seen. That makes it incredibly difficult. And also, of course, the propaganda war is very important. So in recent days and hours, the regime has been out on state broadcasts trying to claim it's got everything under control and that the people in the streets now are pro-government demonstrators showing solidarity with that regime. And obviously the crucial thing is they have been shooting the protesters and there's been enormous violence. And we've seen lots of reports of hospitals overwhelmed with gunshot victims. Thousands of people have been arrested, according to all the information that we have and that we've been able to see verified by independent analysts. And maybe well over 600 people even killed. And we don't know the numbers, and it's very difficult to get accurate data. But so far the repression is very brutal in exactly the kind of way that it always has been under this regime.
We all remember the images and footage we saw during the 2009 Green Movement, the protests in Iran at that time. Comparing that to the situation back then, what would you say on a scale? How does it compare to the situation back then?
It's a different sort of a thing. I think this time what we're seeing is a real kind of, it's driven by the economy for one thing. I mean, it all started off in Tehran, I think, with shopkeepers in the bazaar unable really to continue with their businesses because the currency fell through the floor. The rial just plummeted in value. There's been an amazing steep rise in inflation as well over recent times, partly because of, I think, the Western sanctions on Iran. And that has made life for ordinary Iranians almost impossible. They can't afford basics like bread and potatoes, and people have just been driven to the brink. And so they've come out in their thousands and tens of thousands and more to protest about the economic reality of their lives. That then changed, I think, at some point during the early stages of this latest wave of protests to a real anti-regime movement. And so you heard a lot of chants of, bring down the Ayatollah, the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, and a lot of chants in favor, not all of them, but a significant number of chants calling for the return of the monarchy, and in the particular form of the exiled crown prince, as he's known by his supporters, Reza Pahlavi, who's the son of the last Shah. People seem to want to come back.
Which is sort of an irony because when we look back to 1979, when the Islamic Revolution happened in Iran, the Ayatollah Khomeini at that time, he was greeted by thousands and thousands of supporters when he arrived at the airport. So just to understand what has evolved and what is happening in Iran over the last couple of decades, actually. I mean, there was a huge wave of support for, well, not the Ayatollahs, but the change of the regime before 1979. There was a monarchy and it was abolished, and many people were in favor of abolishing the monarchy. So, what did the Islamic Revolution promise the people, and what happened since then?
I think it's a great point. I mean, one of the problems, obviously, is that older Iranians in particular can remember that time of the Shah's rule, and fine in one sense, it seemed to Western observers from the outside like quite a kind of Western culture that women had much more freedom. There was much more integration with the West in lots of ways, economically and politically, and the Americans, were very closely connected with that regime, that the monarchy. However, at the same time, there was still, or there was then, real fear of the secret police, the Savak, secret state police, who would intimidate, imprison, and torture and repress opponents and dissent. And those memories are still there, which makes Reza Pahlavi's return as the son of the last Shah potentially quite a complex calculation for people, I think. And it's not a straightforward situation in which there is a leader who's in waiting, who has universal support. The biggest problem really that Iranian opposition has faced over the last decades is its fragmentation, the fact that there isn't really a unified umbrella for all of them. Many of those inside the country are now in prison or worse, and outside the country, it's quite a disparate, diverse group. And sure, Pahlavi is definitely one of them. And at the moment, he seems like the guy who's on most people's lips as a potential. And he's certainly very keen now to offer himself up as someone who can bring the country to the next stage and help lead that regime change.
But he's coming sort of out of nowhere. It seems, like you said, we've spoken to a couple of opposition figures over the last couple of years. So there, like you said, there were fragmented groups that were out there and that were present in some way. But at least from my perspective, he was not one of those people who was actually on the radar. So how come that he suddenly evolves as such a prominent figure leading the opposition, or at least part of it?
It's very interesting, and I'm not sure that we necessarily know the full story, but I think certainly what's happened over the last year during the time which I've been talking to him. I interviewed him on the record and spoke to him 3 times over the last year, and I've spoken to his team quite a lot during that period and since, and very recently. He is completely clear that he doesn't want a role as a sort of politician, but he feels a responsibility to his country, and he wants to play a role, and I have no reason to doubt this, but he wants to play a role as a sort of bridge to democracy. He sees himself as a kind of father figure. He also, like, in fair enough in lots of ways, points to the support that he does have for, from within the country and from also outside the country, but the support he has to take on that role. And his social media posts get millions and millions of views, and many of them do seem to be coming from inside Iran. And you can see that, or some people suggest you can see that, because of the way they dropped off when the internet was shut off. So his views were getting tens of millions, and then they went down quite dramatically when the internet was shut off. So it does suggest he has some following, really, alongside obviously the evidence that we've seen of people chanting his name. So there's been a monarchist movement since really the 1979 revolution. That hasn't gone away. Clearly he's the figurehead now, and a lot of people see this as his chance and his moment. And he's been very active over the last year in putting together a team, putting together a program. And one of the things that I've written about that's out on Politico today and then elsewhere, and I'll have it too, is the program that he sees, is the actual agenda for change. And that would include, if you've got a second, I'll just talk you through it. I think it's quite important. I mean, it includes holding a constitutional convention whereby a lot of experts will come together and devise a new constitution for the future of Iran, then putting that plan to a referendum. And he says that on the day after that referendum is held, his job in life will be done and he won't need to do anything else. But crucially, there is still a question about whether this constitutional arrangement will include a monarchy in some form and perhaps a democratically elected government serving in his name underneath it.
Of course, we will share the links to the reports and the interviews that you did in the show notes. But I think it's one thing to post videos on social media and to draft such a program, but the crucial question from my point of view is who will install him. I mean, what is the on the ground? I mean, someone has to bring him to Iran, has to create an environment or a mechanism by which a referendum could be held, by which someone will actually, well, eventually probably suppose him to be the monarch in a constitutional monarchy in Iran or whatever. But is there a plan? I mean, is there a substantial mechanism that is being developed by which this could really happen as soon as the mullahs or the regime in Iran will fall?
It's a really good question. And the answer is, I just don't know. And I'm not sure anyone really knows. I think the way that he certainly sees it is that you cannot have a successful regime change uprising like the one that is currently underway or being attempted in Iran without significant defections from inside the regime itself. So you need people, particularly at the top of the security and military apparatus, to come on board with the opposition, to join, to fracture from the regime and to make a change in power possible. Pahlavi set about trying to encourage this by establishing a secure web portal under which defectors could register their interest in joining his movement. And he did that last June. Since then, tens of thousands of people, his team tells me, have signed up. And they've been, many of these people have been verified and checked out. And they've seen a big surge in the last week or so as well of people signing up, trying to defect. There are also reports, which we can't confirm, that many members of the Iranian military and security forces have been staying at home and not going out to police these protests. And Pahlavi put it in a very striking way to me when he was talking to me at one point last year. And he said, at some point, these troops, these security forces, these police, will need to look at the protesters in the eye and think, these are my children. These are my family members. These are my friends. These are actually people I know and people who I can relate to. and my kids' generation who are taking the streets. And am I really going to shoot into this crowd? Am I really going to perpetrate this violence against these people and all they want is a better life? And that will be a consideration. But at the same time, don't underestimate the brutality and the severity of those security forces and their whole ethos for going about it.
You already mentioned or said that social media plays a pivotal role in the whole development when we look at what's going on in Iran. And I've seen some videos where obviously Iranian people were very they spoke very negatively about the Shah. Said, well, he didn't have any political experience. He is just the son of the Shah. Does that mean he has any legitimacy to play a role in the future in Iran and so on? So, well, of course, there's also support for him, but he is polarizing, I'd say, at least from what we can see online. Well, some say he was a playboy or is a playboy in the United States. I don't know what's correct about it or if what's true. What is your impression? You have followed him so closely for a long period of time. What's your impression? What's his character? What's driving him? How do you see him?
I find him fascinating. I find him in some ways difficult to read, but in other ways, I think he genuinely has a sense that he needs to do something and that he kind of owes his country. He was abroad in 1979. He was a student age kid, really, when the revolution happened and that ended his father's rule in the revolution, and has not been back to the country since then. He does feel like he needs to defend his family. He spoke very warmly about his family's record, about his father's record as somebody who brought in an era of industrialization for Iran and great economic reforms and freedoms, and his grandfather, the Shah before his father, who he says was the sort of architect of modern Iran and is still a kind of revered figure. But I think, the monarchist movement in Iran has been there for a long time. It's kind of never lost sight of him, and his supporters have always had him in mind as somebody who would come back potentially. I think he's been pushing consistently over the last year at least for this kind of change, pointing out to the West that there is an opportunity now that the regime is weak, seeking more help and trying to do whatever he can from afar. There's no question he is a divisive figure. There's absolutely no question that the Pahlavi monarchy is a very controversial and difficult concept for people to accept in a lot of cases in Iran. And it will need to be very, very carefully managed if he does end up being put into that role. But at the same time, perhaps his greatest advantage right now is that there are not any other good options. It's very difficult to see anyone else with the sort of recognition that he has who could credibly command a sort of a position like that at the moment. I mean, that could change, and there are other people, but a lot of them are in prison.
You just said that he is demanding support from the West, so that is a crucial question. And what can the West do? Are we well advised to intervene? Would the Trump administration be well advised to do something to intervene directly in Iran? What role does Europe play? Do we play any role at all? So what's your stance? What's your point of view?
I think for Europe, one of the things that has certainly been frustrating for opponents of the regime is that Europe doesn't tend to do very much other than talk. I mean, there are sanctions, there are long-running sanctions, but this is the classic European foreign policy dilemma. It's difficult to get involved in a dynamic which is so dominated by relations with the United States and Israel, of course. And we've seen that in Gaza and elsewhere. But I think certainly for Europe, what the regime's opponents want is action as well as just warm words of support for people who are putting their lives at risk and in many cases losing their lives on the streets of Iranian cities and towns. And that will include more sanctions. It will include action against diplomats. Particularly, we saw yesterday that the European Parliament has banned Iranian diplomats and officials from entering any of its premises. at any of the three locations. I think that's the sort of very, very minor act that, is the least that they can do, as they admit. But in terms of the West more broadly, you've got Donald Trump, who is saying very clearly that he's prepared to get involved in some form. He's been reviewing military options and will be, again, I think, today looking at the military options for another round of strikes on Iran, potentially. But there is a lot of other action that could be taken, short of military action. For example, we talked about Starlink earlier on, but restoring the communications would be one thing that would be a great benefit for the opposition movements. Also a cyber attack on the regime's communications and those kind of structures of some sort, taking down that propaganda machine, and also to make it more difficult for those security forces to communicate among themselves and orchestrate their crackdown. These are the kind of things that would be short of military action that could really make a difference, because it's, in a way, people like Pahlavi only really have the airwaves, they only have the media by which to affect change. And those communications are so vital for the protesters right now.
But still, I mean, focusing on the military actions or what could be done militarily, what's holding Trump back? I mean, he's been so straightforward when it comes to Venezuela. He's been very active in Israel and Gaza. And then Tehran, we see a regime that's really evil. And they they symbolize everything America must hate. And why is he still reluctant to get rid of those people? What's your impression?
It's a really good question. And I mean, I'm speculating here and I don't know because I'm not inside his head. But if you look, there must be many things going on right now, including the legacy of Iraq and the disaster that followed regime change led by the United States there in 2003. Trump, I think, on some level, does seem to care about the lives of protesters. But I think when it is a different calculation from what was going on really with Maduro in Venezuela, that was actually about protecting American interests, as he argued, at any rate. This is a different sort of a thing. I think he's trying to work out, and presumably people around him are very well aware, that an American intervention might backfire. I mean, one thing that the regime has going for it is that when the US and Israel went to war with Iran last year, it actually, in some sense, strengthened the nationalist tendencies already prevalent in the support base for the regime in Iran, and it could do the same again. And while there are a lot of protests, in a way, almost the most difficult thing would be if there was a foreign intervention that delivered regime change. That would be a very fraught kind of a result, albeit maybe the only option actually for bringing about that change.
Yeah. So, as someone who has been focusing on Iran for quite a long time and following the events closely, I think what is the major misconception we in the West have about Iran and what's going on there from your point of view?
That's a good question. I mean, I feel like sometimes people can get very carried away with the dramatic images, and they really have been dramatic about the scale of these protests, and assume that inevitably, the right team will win and the protesters and the people will triumph. That's really a misunderstanding of the regime. I think it is in Western terms unimaginably brutal, and everyone I'm talking to says you can't underestimate their desire to adapt and to preserve themselves and the lengths they will go to, because they've gone to extreme lengths many, many times before to stay in power.
Tim Ross, thank you very much for talking to us about Iran today.
Thanks so much, Constantin.